Absolutely. And I just want to say hi, Kathleen, and thank
Mm.
you and Ken for inviting me to do this session and for setting it all up and so on. So I'm excited to be here and happy to for this engagement. Um, Going to your question there, I think I'll start by saying that uh, I'm on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change again. I was initially in the mid '90s was my first time, and I haven't always been involved in every one of the assessment reports, but there's another one coming up in a few years, and the work is going on that right now. I'm one of 11 experts from around the planet who are writing the chapter on climate policy. And that's fun because even though I have a really vigorous and large group research team myself at Simon Fraser University, there's 12 people, more than that, including postdocs and adjuncts, but just grad students. We stay on top. We try to stay on top of the literature, but the IPCC process really enables us to learn a lot more. And what we do, the simple message is decarbonization needs to overcome the cost advantages of fossil fuels. They are really cheap per amount of energy they provide. And people might say, well, they're really cheap right now. Well, I would
Mm.
argue and have argued and wrote a book about this 15 years ago that most experts would agree they're very low cost for the quality of energy that you get from fossil fuels. So this is this incredible Faustian problem. We get this great benefit from fossil fuels, but in burning them, we're also wreaking havoc on the planet. And so one of the first things we tell people is that if you want to gauge the climate sincerity of your politicians, they will be either putting a price on carbon or regulating the technologies and fuels that use carbon, and they're probably doing both. But they actually don't have to do any carbon pricing. They can do it all with regulations, and they don't have to do any regulations. You can do it all with a carbon price. And that carbon price is heading up towards $1,000 a ton of CO2. I can tell you emissions will be close to zero. So you look at a government, and I look at the Brian Mulroney government, the Jean Chrétien government, the Stephen Harper government, and you say, have they put a price on emissions, and or are they putting in regulations that will drive decarbonization? And sadly, the three previous long-term regimes under Mulroney, Chrétien, and Harper didn't do any of this.
Mm.
But since 2015, the federal liberals brought in a carbon price, and announced it. It took a couple of years to get it up and running. They didn't need to do that. As I say, they can do it all with regulations, but they did do that. They also did some regulations. They did one regulation that is world leading. They said, we're going to phase out all coal plants by 2030. And that's a big deal. Now, remember that the benefit there is that Ontario had already done that, and coal plants were 25% of its system when it started. And also, even the Alberta NDP government under Rachel Notley had said, we're going to phase out our coal plants by 2030. So the federal Liberals took that and made it into took those examples and made it into a national policy. And that effect is way bigger than the carbon price, at least depending on where the carbon price goes between the year 2022 and 2030. So I'm often talking about a 2030 timeframe because that was the Paris commitment. And then I'll talk about the 2050 timeframe because that's also a big focus now because we're talking about the need for full decarbonization. And then the Liberals did other regulations. They took a regulation on our industries that compete globally, steel, cement, aluminum, chemicals, refining, oil, and said the production of those, we need to see some kind of a regulation or even a carbon price, but one that doesn't affect their cost of production significantly. And this is similar to what we've seen in other leading jurisdictions, whether it's Scandinavia or California. You don't put the full carbon price on every ton of emissions from industry. You go after their marginal emissions, that's their incremental emissions, because that'll at least incrementally incentivize them to reduce. So this policy is called the output-based pricing system, OBPS. That's just a jargon term. I call it a flexible regulation on industry that gives a fine, which is the marginal price. And then finally, there's several other things. They are implementing methane regulations. They are implementing a clean fuel standard. And then there are still other policies, but that would be the big flavor in answer to your question, Kathleen, which is, unlike previous governments, we've seen real initiative in pricing and regulation, and these are actually putting Canada as almost among global leaders.
Thank you. That was a great overview. This is a very basic question, but when do governments use regulations and when do they pass legislation? I mean, what is the reason behind the Trudeau government using regulations? Is it because they don't have to put it through Parliament and deal with the opposition? Or can you just give us a flavor of how government works?
Right. Well, you probably know this better than I do, but in general, we need regulations that government implements are under the auspices of some legislation that has been passed that gave them the authority to regulate. And so you have some piece of legislation. It can be the act that creates the Canadian Environmental Agency. I've forgotten the name. There's been so many names over the years. And you can then put regulations under existing legislation that you have. So if you don't have the legislated regulatory authority, then you're going to have to pass legislation. And at any time, though, people can challenge the legislation in the courts by saying you don't have the authority to legislate, or if you have legislation that's passed and then you try to pass a regulation under it, people can challenge that in the courts and say the legislation doesn't really give you the power to put in that kind of regulation. So in each of the regulations that I just talked about, I'm actually probably hazy. I tend to study, someone else should answer that question if it's important enough to people. For me, it can be important. If the courts won't let you do a certain kind of regulation, then you need to figure out if you can pass legislation that the courts will accept. And we're having this issue even on the output, even on the carbon price, right? The battles that are going on in the courts, does the federal government have that authority? If you look to the US government, it's clear that under President Obama, you had a climate sincere politician for 8 years who, for at least the last 6 of his 8 years, had either a Congress and or a Senate that was in opposition to any kind of climate legislation. And so therefore, President Obama tried to use regulatory authorities that he had under previous legislation, which was the US Clean Air Act, passed in 1970 and amended in 1990. So he couldn't get the Congress to pass legislation. So he did his best to regulate, especially in electricity sector and in transportation, in vehicles, where he already had authority for clean air from the legislation of the Clean Air Act. So that would be, and if Joe Biden is elected as president but still doesn't have the Congress he wants, we're going to see that unfold again in the United States as well, I would predict. So that's this kind of difference.
Well, you give me too much credit. I've worked for an MP and an MPP, but when I read your book, I thought, gee, I hardly know how any of this works, which is one of the reasons we decided to go for a webinar, because I thought, if I, being inside government, don't understand how it works properly, how are most activists going to figure out the system? And as we said in the introduction, be as effective as we can. And pinpoint the tools that we need to work with. So on that note, can you just tell us, you talk about different types of regulations, and I think people might want to know what is out there. For example, you talk about prescriptive regulations. What are those? How do
Okay,
they work?
yeah. And so I will do that, but I just thought of one other thing to help explain the earlier question you had as you kind of led
Oh,
in.
okay.
So I talked about pricing of carbon emissions, CO2, and regulation. So regulating the technologies and energy, and then I'm going to break out the kinds of regulations as you're asking. But when you just said that advocates and activists are unsure what to look for, that is a big message of my book. Is what will climate insincere politicians do? Well, they'll put in some subsidy programs. Now, subsidy programs can be a good idea, even if you're a sincere government, but they are there then to complement the regulations and pricing, to sort of grease the skids, to get some support. But if you just see the subsidy programs, that's paying someone to put up a wind turbine, paying part of the cost, or paying part of the cost for you to retrofit your home to be more efficient and to switch fuels to an electric heat pump. So there's a subsidy program. Another is information programs. Another is sort of saying, one day I will regulate. Well, during the last federal election, Andrew Scheer put out all of these things and said, he said, I have a 65-page climate policy. And he kept saying over and over again, it was 65 pages. So therefore it must have been substantive. And so my research team went through it, and we have, I and my team have, I'm the old one, but I have 30 years of experience with the younger members as they come through my team of modeling the effects based on what we know from from scientific research of effects of policies. And so we simulated Andrew Scheer's policies and found that emissions would actually go up under Andrew Scheer. So this is how knowing about policies and what their effect is how activists can separate like sincere from insincere politicians. And that's why my book has a real simple one. It's got to be pricing and or regulations, and these have to rise in stringency. That's it. So when you're talking to activists and everything, don't get caught up too much in the different kinds of regulations, which I'm about to answer. Just, do they have a price? Are they regulating? And do experts say that the rising stringency of these will decarbonize? And ask no more than that. Now, still, people on our call here, the 60 or 70 people, I know might be interested in a message of my book. This part of the message is almost for us nerdy types. It's me trying to say, when an economist comes up to a politician and says, you got to have carbon pricing, or they try to convince activists, I think it's really important that, and if I were to get the top leading experts in the world, that we tell people what the experts say. You don't need to price carbon. You might want to price carbon because you think it's more economically efficient, or you think it'll be more effective, or you think it's politically easier because you'll take the carbon tax revenue and give it back to people. There may be all these arguments, and you can have debates about that, but it is dishonest to tell people that you have to price carbon. Now, one reason people say that you have to price carbon is because they say it's more economically efficient. It's the cheapest way to achieve our targets. And I agree with, again, here would be 99% of leading economists to say that this is correct. Carbon pricing will be more economically efficient and will be, therefore, if it was the sole policy or the lead policy, the cheapest way to reduce our emissions. However, when economists do this in the literature, and this is a more arcane discussion, but it's what I'm involved in, and it's what I'm involved in when I'm advising political leaders, the Minister of Environment or whatever, is I say, don't believe the economists that all regulations are incredibly economically inefficient, that they're incredibly costly. The empirical evidence, the research shows that it depends on how you design the regulation. And so we can look to jurisdictions that are leading with regulation, and that's almost every jurisdiction in the world that's doing something. So I can pick California, but I can pick British Columbia, and now our federal policies. You try to design regulations that don't pick a technology. They don't say we're going to have electric vehicles. You say we're going to have zero emission vehicles. And so that means it could be hydrogen, maybe in some cases biofuel, maybe electricity. So that's not a prescriptive regulation. A prescriptive regulation would say, we must have electric cars. We must have hydrogen cars. We must have biofuel trucks. A flexible regulation says, let's let consumers and competing businesses figure out the cheapest way to get to a zero emission transportation system. So we will mandate zero emission, but we will let people trade among themselves. We will let them compete with each other. We will not pick technologies. And guess what? When we start to analyze these policies, we find out that they're not that much different from carbon pricing when it comes to economic efficiency. So that's my long-winded answer, and I apologize for it being long-winded, but so I've just taken us a little bit into that rabbit hole of prescriptive versus flexible regulations. And the reason I did that is it provides ammunition for people to say, wait a minute, when you economists just told us we have to have carbon pricing, but it means that Stéphane Dion is going to lose an election, or the Prime Minister of Australia lose an election, and so on. We didn't really need to do that for economic efficiency reasons. And that's why I take you down that rabbit hole.
So basically you're saying that regulations won't be as controversial. I mean, Andrew Scheer won't come out and say, I'm against clean fuel standards or something like that. Whereas carbon pricing, I remember being in the House of Commons where the Harper government was just going on and on about the carbon tax. It was like a religious chant. But I doubt if they could get as worked up or get other people worked up about a clean fuel standard. Is that what you're saying? The regulations are kind of under the radar almost,
right.
Or they're not as politically manipulatable.
Yes, exactly. Easy for you to say.
Yeah.
So first of all, I want to clarify that I actually don't propose specific policies to politicians ever. I try to say, here's the information that I think you need. You need information about design, about effectiveness, about economic efficiency. And then also, I'm going to guess that you're going to want information from political scientists and policy advisors about the political feasibility, the political acceptability, the political, and all climate policies are really difficult. And that's why mostly will go nowhere, because for a domestic country to act in what's a global problem, there's all sorts of incentives and reasons. We know this from decision theory about why we don't act domestically. So already climate policy is difficult. And my point is, make sure you've done a good job of informing the politician of all the factors that are critical to their decision. Don't overwhelm them with information, but what are the key factors, And so I've said, oh, shouldn't we look at the research from the political scientists about the challenges of winning an election with a carbon price? So first of all, I think your instincts are good. What the evidence is showing is that, first of all, the climate insincere politicians will lie about anything. So I'm sorry, but democracy is not perfect. It's not this ethical, blah, blah, blah. And even in the good old days of the British parliamentary, I think there was a lot of lying going on then. I think if you really study history. And so lying goes on, and blatant lies. And so then the question becomes, if someone's going to lie, and so let's say in British Columbia and California, we have a low carbon fuel standard. And there was a blip up in gasoline prices on the West Coast a year ago. And the opposition party, this was in California, the Republicans, and here the party in British Columbia said, oh, that's caused by the low carbon fuel standard.
Oh, no. And
they were completely lying. And there was articles in the newspaper and so on. But then some polling later on showed that very few people picked up on that. It's kind of what you were just saying, Kathleen. It was harder for people to lie about it because it just didn't pick up the interest of the public. When it comes to carbon pricing, people will say to me, well, carbon pricing is great because polls show that 60% of Canadians support carbon pricing. So 60% support, 40% don't, you win. You'll win all the elections. Well, first of all, our elections don't work like that. You can form a majority government with 40% of the votes, as Stephen Harper did, because it's not a proportional representation system. And secondly, to win, like when I spent a lot of time, and I have for 30 years, just by luck of people I knew and so on, with the people who do the polling for governments when they're getting ready for election or for parties that are trying to defeat people. And the polling is not about what does 60% of Canadians want versus 40%. The polling that people kept stuffing in front of my face was, what do 3 or 4% of people in key swing ridings, how many of them are willing to flip their vote because of this one issue? So if we lie to them about carbon tax, maybe it won't cause 97% of the voters in a 905 riding in Ontario, 97% won't change their vote. We'll lie to them about the carbon tax, but this won't be the thing that changes the vote. But 3% will be, oh, that resonates with me. It's government tax. If I'm paying a tax on gasoline, I see it at the pump. I'm going to believe the person that tells me the government's not giving it back to me, so they're ripping me off. I have no and then Andrew Scheer says I have no choices. I got to get the kids to soccer and hockey and to school, and it's a car-oriented area out here in the suburbs, and you just need a tiny percent of those people to vote differently. And it really looks like the carbon price is more susceptible to that. And there's actually a lot of good research for that. In my book, I refer to some of that research. Brian Kaplan, who I think is at Yale now, or actually I'm not sure where he is, a professor who did a great book about 10 years ago, showing how some of the things that we economists think, oh, free trade benefits everyone. Well, what are the percentage of people that don't believe that? Fiscal policy, so changing tax rates will improve things for people. The percentage of people that say, no, you're changing my tax, you're probably increasing my tax in some way, unless it's a blatant tax cut. So this is my way of just explaining to you the research and literature there, and why if you say that it's nonsense, I'm sorry, for someone to say 60% of Canadians support carbon pricing, so it's a political winner. And I have to spend a lot of time explaining the knowledge of experts. It's not my field of research, but the research there is really clear.
Well, I'd like to get back to what's doable. A lot of people, I think, joined this webinar because we said we need to know what's doable. We've got a minority Liberal government. We've got the NDP, the Greens, and even the Bloc are fairly progressive environmentally. And so I know certain parties prefer to talk about pharmacare and things, but when we go back post-COVID or pre-post-COVID, what should we as activists be saying to the Liberal government needs to be done? I know you don't like telling people what to do, but can you just give us a hint at 2 or 3 regulations that might make us more effective when we say we want more action? What they've done is so far reasonably good, but there's a heck of a lot more that needs to be done. Could you give us possibly 3 possibilities that we could lobby about?
Yes, but my book is about delusion, and it's the delusions or myths or wishful thinking biases that are the real dangers for us. I
know, but that's why we're asking you. Get us past those myths.
And I'm going to tell you what those ones are.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is push for rising stringency in the policies I already told you. That's it. So that list is very short. I've written about it in policy options and so on. The list is very short. I just gave it to you. It was the coal plant phase out. It was the methane regulations, the clean fuel standard, the output-based pricing system, and the carbon price if you want to increase it. But I don't think they'll increase that very much. That's it. Now,
no other regulations?
No. 0. Well, I mean, provinces need to follow what we just got the city of Vancouver to do in buildings. So you need you need every urban government that has the authority or its provincial counterpart to do what the city of Vancouver passed last week, which is basically you're not going to be able to build anything that burns natural gas or oil in Vancouver starting in 2 years. So that's the building sector. But no, I think it's more important that I tell you about the delusions, the wishful thinking bias. So let me just spend a few minutes on that. I hear people, and even my good friend Elizabeth May, seem to used to say that, we need government to spend a whole bunch of money. And we'll be able to tell the climate sincerity of a government by how much money it's willing to spend. So this could be in major infrastructure, public transit, or in high voltage transmission lines to renewable electricity, although that one would be fairly good. But it's all this and government subsidy programs for people to be more energy efficient. So these kinds of programs, if they're a substitute for the things that you now know should be happening, that's bad news. And believe me, at a time like this, politicians would rather do that. They don't want to tighten regulations because they're politically difficult. The stuff that really reduces emissions is politically difficult. The stuff that is giving people their tax money back and has very little effect is politically easy. So, and the problem is that the politician has climate activists believing that if government spends more money to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And it lets us off the hook. We really need to stop buying gasoline cars. And that happens when you have a regulation that says you can no longer buy gasoline cars, which is what Quebec and BC have in California, and that we need a federal one, a federal zero. Oh, if there is one thing to go for, it's a zero emission vehicle standard federally.
Okay.
That copies BC and Quebec and California. But so I just wanted to talk about those government subsidy programs. We're saying it's COVID right now and we need to throw a bunch of money. A lot of the money right now is just, as it should be, is simply to give money to people who suddenly lost their incomes. It isn't to go and invest in a whole bunch of new things, because actually the capital stock is still there. So I've given you, I think I haven't done a good job in this answer, so let me just summarize. You asked me about regulations, and I'm saying tighten the regulations we already have. The clean fuel standard needs to be finalized. And we need a ZEV mandate.
What's that?
The zero emission vehicle. So it requires,
right.
And it shouldn't have any government money involved. In California, it doesn't. It requires manufacturers to sell a growing share of what are deemed zero emission vehicles. And if they don't, they pay a very large penalty per car. And so what happens is they start to raise the price of, who knows, some kind of gas guzzling vehicles in order to subsidize the price of electric vehicles. So the cost of electric vehicles would be much lower, so that typical middle-class people, younger families, if they're going to have a vehicle, would be able to get an electric vehicle. So that's my answer to your question, is do more of what you're already doing and maybe add a few on. And then I wanted to roll into that answer, though, don't keep telling governments to do something that's not as effective and that will get wiped out anyway as soon as government budgets are in big trouble, which they're going to be.
Thank you. Could I just ask you about tax policies? I mean, is there anything that you see that can be used in that way to put the screws to the fossil fuels?
Right. So the carbon price does that, but every one of these regulations does that too. The clean fuel standard will force a rising price of gasoline and diesel in order to subsidize electricity, renewables, and hydrogen in transportation. So, and then government doesn't need, to use the carbon price as the driving policy for that. And so, because when you use tax policy like that, that was the point I was making earlier. That's what's so difficult to do.
But I was thinking of other tax policies. Is there anything else, any other way you can use taxation?
Yes. I mean, so just to give one example, where we are trying to get, let's say we're trying to get we're trying to pass a regulation that all townhouses and apartments need to be phasing in electric vehicle recharging in virtually every parking stall that they have. There's a way to use a combination of regulations and some kind of break on first the taxes on the equipment itself. Then there could be issues related to property taxes, but that would be at a municipal government level. So yes, there are things like that, and also fees and licenses. So the city of Vancouver wants to, put larger fees on. It is raising parking fees for vehicles, and then thinking about differentiating those fees. Well, they are differentiated increasingly if it's where you're charging with an electric vehicle recharger, and soon with electric vehicles, then the parking fee would be lower. So that's an example of fees, licenses, subsidies, and so on.
I'm just wondering if Ken has any questions, or whether we should go to audience questions. Ken?
He's muted himself. Here he comes.
Hi, I'm back. Yes, we have 5 questions have come in. I think we could, I'll pose those to Mark. Mark, we want a price on carbon, but politically acceptable price is so much smaller than the price swings in the marketplace. Think about fuel prices a year ago compared to today. The difference is equivalent to a $300 per ton additional carbon tax. Even Vancouver's weekly price swings are larger than the BC carbon tax. How does this affect the rationale for putting a price on carbon?
Right.
That's
so
from Mark Lee.
Yeah, and so that is the challenge. If we pretend that politicians live in this kind of ideal bubble of sort of the textbook policy world that some academics have in their head, then I've heard academics saying, "Oh, this is great. The price of oil is plummeting. The price of gasoline and other refined products, diesel and so on, are plummeting. They're way lower. This is the perfect chance for government to ramp up the carbon tax because people won't see it at the pump. They'll say, oh, the price fell from $1.20 to 70 instead of to 60. They're not going to notice that. And so, but this sort of is this image of the politicians as this very quick animal, able to jump in here and do that, and is free of all of these political constraints. Whereas the reality is that politicians at a time like this are also under pressure to relax the carbon price, to actually diminish it. And the British Columbia government has said, we're not going to do that, but it's actually delayed the latest increase in the carbon price. It says it'll do it post-COVID, but there's an example. So I do agree that the fact that, and in fact, my book talks a lot about, and I've published articles on this, oil prices. If we're going to succeed globally in decarbonizing the transportation system, oil prices are going to get very low, and they could get quite low in the next decade or so. They'll bounce back from the lows right now of COVID, but we know they were way higher in 2014 than they have been in 2015 to 2020. So the questioner's question is a very valid one. What happens with a regulation like a zero emission vehicle standard is you're just requiring people to you're requiring the industry to keep reducing its sales of gasoline vehicles. And it'll have to use cross subsidies to make that happen. So I still would like to see a rising carbon price where politically feasible. But I think this latest development shows you how regulations can play a key role. And in fact, as I'm very worried, people are like, oh, COVID has shown us we can be really different. Look how low emissions are. And I keep saying to people, no. The physical equipment that burns fossil fuels is sitting there. The planes didn't go to a crusher. The cars didn't go to a crusher.
Are you recommending that? Just asking.
Well, yeah, don't quote me on this. But it goes on and on. I give like the electricity plants, the factories, you name it. They're all there. They're the equipment what they burn to get energy is fossil fuels. So, we are going to see, if the economy springs back, which I think there's a good chance it will over the next 12 months, you're going to see a real rise in emissions again. And so the idea is to hang in there with policies in my view, that's a strength of the regulatory policies.
Okay, thank you. Another question from John. What do you think of electricity being included in the OBPS? If it is not trade exposed, but I suppose they can argue carbon tax would impact hydro rates that would indirectly impact trade exposed industry. It's a problem in Ontario because existing gas plants pay only about 12% of the carbon tax, and we're looking at a project 200 million tons of CO2 equivalent from gas plants over the next 2 decades.
Okay, just to make sure for everyone, so the question is, do you regulate? I've talked about how where we can really decarbonize rapidly. And if you look at Scandinavia and now California, it's in those sectors like your electricity sector, your transportation sector, your building sector. And the reason is because it will make electricity more expensive. It will make vehicle mobility more expensive. It may make the full cost, including capital cost of buildings, more expensive. So not dramatically, none of this dramatically, but it means that industries can say, oh, you decarbonized electricity, you increased our cost of production, we trade globally, and so you've given us this big disadvantage. Well, and so therefore, don't put us under a domestic full decarbonization. Instead, put us under this thing I was describing to Kathleen, the output-based pricing system, which prices just some of the emissions, but not all. And it kind of gives a subsidy back to industry so that their cost of production doesn't go up dramatically. So that was an explanation of what this person's question was, just for people who are not as familiar, and I can give a short answer. We do a lot of modeling of the industrial sector, and we're doing more work. I have 2 students, one a PhD and a master's, working on this right now. It's my former PhD student is one of the global leaders, Chris Bataille, and working on this in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And anything that we're looking at still shows that, at least in a jurisdiction like Canada, and I would argue even in Alberta and Saskatchewan, so where we're really fossil fuel is intensive in electricity production, we can see dramatic decarbonization. So even in places like sort of getting our emissions down 90% from where they are today in the electricity sector, and our Canadian electricity sector is not that emissions intensive, without it having a huge effect on the price of electricity over the next 2 decades. So as you're phasing that, well, even over the next decade, as you're phasing that out, just to give you one example, the coal plants in Alberta and Saskatchewan could be converted, some are in part, to biomass. And, and even with you capturing the CO2 from the biomass plants and burying it. And we've been looking at some cost estimates of this. It's not that dramatic. So I would argue that from the evidence I've seen, and there could be places where I'm wrong on this, but in general, whether it's Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Alberta, and even Alberta and Saskatchewan, over the next 10 years, we can significantly decarbonize electricity. And so you don't need to put it in the output-based pricing system. You can do it as part of the clean air, the regulatory requirements that we've already been using. And I know there's work going on in government right now to try to make sure that the coal plants in Alberta and Saskatchewan don't get just replaced by natural gas plants. I think that's going to be the key battleground there, and we're working on that.
Thank you. I would have thought, though, you'd be suggesting rather than a little bit of biomass, but solar and wind are perfectly adapted to Alberta and Saskatchewan. So it seems like the natural choice, especially with where prices are going now.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad you just intervened on that, because in my head, it was like, okay, but you have these plants that are dispatchable and their infrastructure, they're connected to the grid. And increasingly, even with these kind of biomass plants, you can ramp them up and down, which means they can be good complements to wind and solar, which are non-dispatchable, meaning, you only get the electricity when the wind's blowing and the sun's shining. And so they can be well teamed. And so I'm really glad you brought this up, Ken, because I should have said, because in Alberta and Saskatchewan, a huge part of this can be wind and solar. And when we look at the costs, don't include everything. So when people say wind and solar are cheaper than a natural gas turbine, I've seen no evidence to support that, because the wind and solar don't provide dependable electricity. So you have to team them with a battery or a hydro reservoir. And so we always incorporate the real costs of doing that. And when we do that, they're not the cheapest. But again, my answer more generally is, what I'm saying is that the cost of electricity to industry, and remember, industry's costs are not the same as for residential consumers, that their costs won't go up dramatically over a 10-year period. And if it did, governments can step in a little bit and help out with that, as they've done in Sweden, for example.
This modeling you do, does the federal government do similar modeling, and do other groups do similar modeling? Are your models very different than what other economists find that do sustainability modeling?
Good question. In the first half of my career, and kind of what actually helped to make my name as an international researcher and get me into the Royal Society of Canada, this thing where you get recognition that you've gotten international recognition. My work was in model design. A lot of the models were really flawed. They were either these models that just looked at technologies but didn't think about human decision-making behavior, or they were these simplistic econometric models, so economists used, that were based on statistics but had no technological detail in them. And they were all wrong. And so I was one of the group of international scholars really working and researching and publishing in this area. And I would say about 15 years ago, it started in the US with the US government's, the good thing in the US is they had a separate institution, the Energy Information Administration, which was deliberate to keep it out of politics. It was set up under, I don't know what it was set up under, well, probably during the energy crisis, maybe under the Carter regime, but there was things where it answered to Congress, but the head of it was appointed by the president. And that group slowly developed a model called NEMS, the National Energy Modeling System. And I was involved in helping a little bit with the design of that. So this is quite a long time ago. This is 20 years ago, at least. And it kind of set a standard, and more governments have followed that. When I was on the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy in the early 2000s in Canada, we were criticizing the federal government, the Chrétien government, for not having good models federally. And then kind of at the end of the Chrétien era, Paul Martin, and even under Stephen Harper, to Harper's credit, we finally developed a suite of models federally that I think are just fine. So when people tell me these are bad models, I say, I think they're pretty good. And they test them all the time. And there's a major group at Stanford University called the Energy Modeling Forum, which provides a way to compare models. And then I'll give a little shout out, though, that a lot of the major modelers in Canada, whether in government or outside, are usually former students of mine. And the number one modeling group in the country is a consulting firm in Vancouver called Navius. And they have a model so our models have technological detail, but they also have human behavior, what we call microeconomics. That's how people decide whether to get this car or that car. Right. And they have some macroeconomics, which is what is the total effect on your economy? What is it going to do to government spending, employment, interest rates, and so on.
Okay, thank you. Another question might be just a yes/no answer for this one from Guy Dauncey. Why not also have a regulation to require all new light vehicles to be electric by 2030?
Right. So I would say, so I'm arguing that the ZEV mandate in British Columbia, which I think should be federal as well, be 100% by 2030. But from the earlier part of my talk, Guy, that it would not be electric. it would be zero emission. I don't want to pick the technology. I want to be as close as possible to a carbon price. Just because I've pointed out that you don't have to do carbon pricing doesn't mean that I've suddenly given up my economist badge. We want this to be as economically efficient as possible. Who knows? Maybe half the vehicles will be hydrogen at that time, or maybe we'll still be using a lot more biofuels, and we'll modify and say, oh, actually we can use ethanol, and we can. It's not gonna do all of our transportation. Maybe only 10% or 15% of replacing gasoline and diesel. Right now in Sweden and Finland, and I think Norway, but I'm not sure, the liquid fuels sold for transportation, 20% are biofuels from forest wastes, a bit from agriculture, a bit bought overseas, and I just don't rule that out. I want us to get. I just know we're so likely to fail. A big message in my book is that we can't be rigid about everything. We can't be entirely against nuclear power, entirely against large hydropower, entirely against biofuels, entirely against using fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. We can't afford to let perfection be the enemy of good. And so I'm looking for, that's one of my messages, and now you've given me a chance to say it in my book, is the rigid positions, like this is right and this is wrong, is part of the problem. And it's we who are climate sincere citizens who are partly causing that problem.
Well, I do really like, sorry, go ahead, Kathleen.
Well, I was just going to say, one of the reasons for this webinar is that we can be more effective so that we can push green and sustainable and renewable energy, and we don't have to fall back on nuclear and everything. We're trying to be as effective as we can in terms of renewables so that we don't have to spend billions on carbon capture and propping up these 20th century industries or energy industries. But can I just do you have another question?
Can I respond to that? Can I respond?
All
Kathleen?
right. I don't want to get into a huge debate over nuclear. I'd rather get back to the practicalities.
No, but I'll just say to you, if the evidence showed you that doing some carbon capture and storage, so still using fossil fuels, but capturing the carbon, and maybe it's only a small percentage of the contribution, ended up way cheaper somewhere and was easier to get political buy-in and increase the chance, the very low chance that humanity would act on climate, would you be so rigid that you'd be completely opposed to that? Like if the Albertans said, we'll buy in, but we're still going to get 5% of our energy from fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage, would you tell them, nope, no deal, let's just burn the planet down?
I'd say maximum 5, that's it.
Okay.
Anyway.
What if they said 15%?
I'd say no dice.
You'd burn up the planet. You'd burn up the planet because of your rigid
lot of money
position.
being directed to that.
No, it was cheapest.
Nuclear is terribly expensive, for example.
I said to you, I'm giving you a hypothetical. What if it was cheapest? What if the carbon capture
what if.
storage?
I'm not an expert on carbon capture, but it seems a very expensive process. So, but what if in all the best of all possible worlds that it wasn't dangerous, it wasn't expensive, whatever? Possibly, yes.
Good.
But can we get back on, Ken, are there any more viewer questions?
It's up to 14 of them now.
Oh, okay.
Maybe I'll ask them a few more. How would you deal, Mark, with the oil and gas industry asking for federal support bailout money as an emergency COVID response?
Right. So this is, I've been answering this on media at various times, and I think, so there's two things. One is what do you do for the workers, the people who are there? So again, much of my book and even our discussion here early on is the real world of policy making, the real constraints under which policymakers operate. I do argue that a climate sincere government in Canada, in a federation like Canada, will do some things that us purists who don't get elected and who couldn't get the 40% or whatever is needed to form even a minority government, or 33% or whatever, they will have to do things like that. They may even have to agree to build an oil pipeline to the coast of British Columbia and pay for it so that we're not having a fight about national unity for the next 5-6 years, and which will put all of our climate policies aside. Now, I'm saying that hypothetically, maybe I'm wrong. And I'm not saying that's for sure. I'm not saying for sure the federal government ought to have funded the Trans Mountain Pipeline. But I'm saying I can understand why, and I'm really shocked at people that can't understand why. I just see that as a lack of imagination. It's like, I want this, I want this. What's the real world of you being the Prime Minister of Canada? What are the constraints and trade-offs you have to make, even if you're climate sincere? I wanted to give that context in answering this question. Now, you talk about money going to the oil and gas sector. So to some extent, these guys are in big trouble anyway. And if the companies do badly, again, it's not like the capital stock disappears. What happens is people go bankrupt, and that's a horrible thing, and there are repercussions to that, but corporations may go bankrupt. Someone else will buy that capital stock. So the economist, the purist economist says, oh, government shouldn't step in. That's part of market economics. At the same time, but I think what I've seen so far from the federal government, subject to correction, is that they've been saying, here's how we'll put the money in. We might help them in sort of some of their ability to take on more debt in some ways. In other words, that some companies will be able to hang on with their ownership and not lose all their equity. So I can see some policies like that being all right. But then the government has really said, we're going to put money into, to cleaning up old oil and gas sites and so on. And I can understand that. I mean, we should have never been in this world. Governments in Alberta for a long time should have always made that you have to set aside money in a fund that covers all of this costs. That's a travesty. But if I'm now in the federal government presently, I'd rather get money to the workers. And then finally, we do need, this is where the government can put money in. And I just gave you this example of bioenergy in those coal plants. Imagine, and also in helping out with wind and solar, where you are doing investments that are part of the transition, the decarbonization of the electricity sector in this particular case.
I think some of the argument against the Trans Mountain and a lot of this other bailout is the banks are still investing a huge amount of money in fossil fuels, and one of the biggest problems with making the transition to a clean, low carbon future is having enough investment money. We're spending about 1/3 of $1 trillion on renewables every year, and we should be spending $1 trillion. But we just spent 1.7 trillion. The banks just invested 1.7 trillion in the last 3 or 4 years since the Paris Agreement in fossil fuels. So I can't agree with you on the Trans Mountain, but that's not.
Oh, but just a second, you just talked about banks. So were you talking globally or in Canada?
Globally. Well, the banks in Canada are doing more than their fair share, I can assure you.
No, but you just jumped on me. You just changed.
Oh, no.
So globally, Canada can't control if money goes into oil production in the United States, or in Brazil, or in Saudi Arabia. And the Earth's crust is chock-a-block full of oil. And so it's like to say that we stop our government and banks from putting money into our oil industry. I just think it's not a smart thing to be doing. I was just explaining it politically, but in terms of us getting off of fossil fuels, Canada could shut down its supply tomorrow, and that won't affect things. What we need to do, and that's why I keep saying this, and Kathleen, your strategy, we need to flip our transportation system. That's where oil demand comes from. We need to be part of a global coalition with China, Norway, California, that is decarb, and in the book I talk about the use of carbon tariffs for countries that are expanding transportation systems that are going to be based on oil. And that's the only way that the global demand for oil falls and the emissions related to that. And by the way, when that happens, banks won't be putting money into the oil sands because that's the highest cost marginal producer in the world. It's the first to go, and it will go. And so, but us stopping it and fracturing the country might be one strategy, but I would be asking you, wouldn't the better strategy be to decarbonize our transportation system and work to make that global? So look at what Norway's doing. Norway's saying, okay, we'll still produce oil. There are reasons in our country. We're not going to expand it. But what we're going to do is decarbonize our transportation system quickly, and we're pushing this globally. To me, that's a way smarter policy.
So you're all about demand side, not supply side.
I mean, I'm about supply side in some cases, but no, I wouldn't try to stop coal mining on the planet. Like, you could mine coal anywhere on the planet. I wouldn't try to stop oil production on the planet or in one particular spot on the planet, because you can get oil from anywhere on the planet. If anything, I wrote a book 15 years ago called Sustainable Fossil Fuels. People said we were heading to peak oil. And I was like, that's not what the international experts are saying. The people who are experts on innovation and the potential to make oil products on the planet were saying there's just a huge amount. So that's why I said, and I'm saying to Kathleen, maybe we should try to make a deal with people if we want to get success, make a deal with the people who are really focused on their fossil fuel endowment. Don't assume that they're going to agree with you. So try to meet them halfway and say, okay, maybe you can use that, but you're going to have to produce hydrogen and electricity and things that are part of a clean transportation system. And I think this is what the federal government has been talking about in Alberta as well. Saying, we're not telling you your economy has to be annihilated and we're going to stop everything to do that. We're telling you you can't be part of producing greenhouse gas emissions anymore. We know you have a valuable resource, and we will try, when you're doing the right thing, to make that work for you.
Well, that's one reason. One of the first things that our group, CCL Now, called for was a Green Jobs Transition Bill with funding, so that Kenny can't manipulate the oil and gas workers, because they need a future. So, but anyway, are there more questions?
Yeah, I've got.
Can I ask? Give me a few minutes. I really would like to ask Mark at the end, before the end. When we go back to Ottawa, or even before we go, but we can actually physically go back to Parliament Hill, what sense of lobbying? You mentioned that you lobby deputy ministers and you're on Parliament Hill. Is there anything we innocent or naive activists need to know about how government works that might give us the key to the hill? In terms of lobbying?
I don't lobby.
No, but you go and talk to them.
No, they call me.
Oh, well.
But you do get arrested sometimes, Mark.
Yeah.
Share on that. I haven't got the answer to that one yet about the.
Yeah, but not in Parliament Hill. But no, the reason I answered about lobbying quite vociferously is because, I mean, the role of an independent expert is literally, there's no point me trying to approach a politician. It's, are they ready? Do they want my point of view? And so I do that when it can be at any level, tries to get my perspective. And that's when I'll offer it. But what I do is I don't lobby for a particular policy. I end up telling them, here are the pros and cons, here are the things you need to look at from the evidence that we have. But Kathleen, I've already, I would argue an obvious one is, why don't we have a national ZEV mandate? I wouldn't be surprised if we're close to getting that, especially when you have a government in Ontario that the federal government knows is not going to participate here. You already have a model in Quebec and British Columbia, so that covers a fair bit of the population. And it's an easier one to push. So think politically in Norway today. It's an oil exporting country. It's like, I don't know, 4.5, 5 million people. And they are decarbonizing their transportation system. I mean, that's impressive. Why aren't we doing that? And so I would focus on something like that, to be honest.
Well, part of the reason is because they have this huge fund from their oil, unlike Alberta, that allows them to incentivize the electric vehicles through this $1 trillion fund, just the interest on the $1 trillion fund they have.
Nope.
No?
The way the electric vehicles are happening is they have they've used taxes. The purchase tax is lower. The annual relicensing tax is lower. The parking taxes are lower. But it's also been part of this major campaign. So it isn't about government spending. I've said this several times now. The evidence doesn't support that assumption, Ken. It isn't government spending. The Norwegians have been putting that money away in a kitty bank. They've given a lot of it to developing countries. They also have an incredible welfare system and society, of course, with that money. But it isn't the money itself that has dramatically, they have a carbon tax, they have a carbon price, they have a lot of regulations.
Just on my defense, though, when you are able to lower the license fees and the taxes on stuff, that's partly because you have other sources of revenue. It makes it much easier. Sure.
Yeah, but they have very high tax. Yes, and have they taken money from their trust fund to do that? That's not what I understand.
Okay. A question about this zero emission vehicle standard. Right now, I think the goal. Guy is saying that the goal is set for 2040, not 2030. So do you definitely support 2030 as the transition time?
Yep. So for example, the Norwegians, it looks now like they're going to hit 100% sales are what they're call electric. Some of them are plug-in electric, and I think one other category in there. And they're going to hit that. It looks like they're saying we'll hit it by 2025, could be even sooner than that. And there's no reason why we can't hit it in 2030.
Thank you. Here's one question on from Lynn Adamson. Isn't it a good idea to do both carbon pricing and also other regulations? We did not lose the last election on it. It succeeded. Most MPs elected supported it. Perhaps because of the dividend, people could understand the money was coming back to them and that most families would get more back than they would spend. And attached to that is another question from someone else saying, shouldn't we be sending a check out every January so people really see that it's separate from the taxes?
So all I can do is report on, the evidence of experts. And I have to answer this question a lot. And in fact, if you read my chapter on, it's called We Must Price Carbon, I explain the research on this. To summarize, the different ways in which we can give back carbon pricing does not solve the problem that I described to Kathleen earlier about the ability of climate insincere politicians to make more headway with lying about carbon pricing than lying about regulations. And the headway they need to make is in a few swing ridings. It is the few ridings that change from one election to the next to determine who becomes the minority or majority, the party that forms government. And so that's my answer to that. I answered it earlier. She might not have heard it, which is fine. And
well, she asked it a while ago, so that's part of it.
Yeah, and I don't want to repeat the entire answer for the people who are on here. What I do say is, in my book, I go into this in great detail, including the detail about if you give people back the money in different ways, will they then be good about it? And lots of people are really, already people are really happy with carbon pricing. 60% of people, it's kind of like, it's not that they're happy, it's like they understand we have to take our medicine. So we got to
the carbon price is so low it doesn't have any impact. That's part of the way the medicine is easy to take.
Absolutely. And so, but anyway, the point was that, so Barry Rabe and other people do a bunch of, he's an American political scientist, they do a bunch of surveys on different ways in which you give back carbon revenue, and work on this in the United Kingdom. And does it have an effect? And we summarize all of this. I mean, it's summarized in previous Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, but we're doing it again. And I would say it's pretty ambiguous. It's like, nope, if you have a populist group trying to win power, and they are going to lie about carbon pricing in some jurisdiction in the world, your rational arguments about, oh, don't worry, you're getting a check every 3 months now, doesn't seem to be able to overcome that for everyone. And you need to overcome it for everyone, because I'm keep telling you, it's just 2 or 3% of voters that we have to worry about here. So saying, oh, all my neighbors are fine, they love the check, doesn't help us. You need to look at polling, which shows who might swing their vote in a key riding because of this. And if it's 3 to 5% of those voters, that's what matters.
Right.
Well, look at Doug Ford winning in Ontario.
Yeah, and I'm not saying
with his lies.
Absolutely. And I mean, lies don't always work. People will, like Andrew Scheer's lies might have worked on climate, but maybe for other reasons, social conservatism, who knows? He wasn't able to capture those swing ridings. It can also be all sorts of things like charisma and so on. I mean, we know politics is a very irrational process, right? So I'm not saying that I would argue that often climate policy is just not what determines people's voting. People who are climate sincere and concerned like us, we think, oh, wow, people should vote for this party or that party because they're going to do something about climate. Well, we know what percentage of people voted for the Green Party, right? It's not that many people who are going to vote on that issue alone. So if we want to make the world better, we have to take our neighbors as we find them, not as we wish they were.
Here's a slight shift. This is about municipal level recommendations, because we've been talking mostly federally, provincially. This is from Nancy, if you were on a municipal committee making recommendations to council for their climate emergency plan, what would be your top 3 actions that you would recommend?
Copy the city of Vancouver. So they're doing, it was interesting. We had a very good mayor and city council for a decade, Gregor Robertson, Andrew Reimer, and others. And I mean, they were focused. I kept saying to them, you got to focus on fuel switching. You got to say we're getting rid of burning, gasoline and oil in our transportation system and natural gas in our buildings, because you're a city, you're not industry. So it isn't, burning natural gas for high temperature in an industrial process or even for generating electricity. And so you got to focus on those 2 things. And the city of Vancouver initially was focused on mode shift in transportation and on sort of and on energy efficiency. And so mode shift is getting more people out of their cars and into transit by active mobility, so biking and walking. And they've done wonderful things in that. And it's also, pedestrian areas and the way you do concentrated development around the transit system. Those things are all important, but they're to do with reducing energy use, and there's some fuel switching implications, but you really need the vehicles to not be burning gasoline anymore. And that swamps everything. So we do modeling. We've done modeling for the city of Vancouver, where we've shown them that their efforts to get people into transit are even when they're wildly successful and get close to European standards by 2050, they're still, you're not decarbonizing in any significant way. The vehicles have to change. Now that's hard for a city to do that, but the city of Vancouver is trying to do it by how it restricts the access of gasoline cars relative to zero emission vehicles, and they're going to do more on that. When it comes to the building stock, they've been very aggressive. And I would say to them, look, at efficient buildings doesn't cut it if those buildings are still going to be burning natural gas, because after you built the building, people are going to add, I don't know, a hot tub or a patio heater or who knows what. You need regulations that prevent them from hooking up to natural gas or putting in oil or something like that. And that's where Vancouver has been moving very dramatically in the last 5 years. And I invite people, you can easily look that up, go on their website, and you'll see what they're doing.
Thank you. This is from Rowan Nuttall. How do you simulate policies? How would you improve these models? What's missing from them? Is there a repository of simulated regulations that the public can browse and comment on in order to strengthen them?
So, right. I mean, I'm going to sound elitist, but I wouldn't want me reviewing the epidemiological models, the pandemic models, and helping to improve them. Like, I wouldn't trust me doing that. So there are things we've written about modeling types, and I invite people to send me an email. It's simply my last name at sfu.ca, because what I can do is select through, back from the debates when we had modeling typology debates, especially in the 1990s. I actually wrote things in policy options and other, and I've saved up stuff that other experts have written, which really simplified why we should move to the kind of models that we now use. And those are models in which we simulate people making a decision about whether to get this furnace or that furnace, this level of insulation in their home or that level, this vehicle or that vehicle. And then we do a lot of what's called revealed and stated preference research, which is studies that say, okay, when we tried to do that with certain policies in California, what did we see happen over 5 years? Or we tried to do it in Sweden over a 20-year period. And can we estimate the behavioral parameters? Like, oh, people have a bias against this or a bias for that. And the reason I talk about this, it's really a science. There's an art side to it. But often when I'm explaining it to the average, the typical person who's not an expert, I have to warn those people not to bring their own views, like, I would have done this. We often find that we self-delude because we think other people think like us. So the first thing you learn as a social scientist is you are carrying a lot of bias with you. And so
Mark, I resemble that remark.
And so do I. And so do I. And so this is what we've learned is we bring that with us. And so that's why there's a whole, empirical scientific approach here. It's still got lots of uncertainty. It's still, it's not foolproof, but it's the best we've got. And the systems are so much better now. I just don't worry about the models anymore. I can, when I ran the model showing that the Liberals, before this last election, were not going to hit their Paris target, all different experts got numbers similar to mine. When I showed the Conservatives the emissions would actually rise, there was somebody else, Dave Sawyer, who's a well-known modeler, had them falling slightly, somebody else rising even more. We were all in this range, and it wasn't like we just follow each other. We do it independently. It's
Right.
it's pretty obvious if Andrew Scheer is just saying, I'm going to give some subsidies, but get rid of the regulations, get rid of the carbon price, I can kind of estimate where it's going to go.
Great, thank you. Could I ask a couple slightly different questions that I have? The work of Tony Seba, I assume you're aware of his work, Clean Disruption? Guy out of Stanford? No, okay. And we won't follow on that one. He suggests strongly that the governments will be last to be involved or know about the transition away from to electric vehicles, away from fossil fuel based cars. It's just based on economics and technology. When the price drops enough, they're going to take off. And he's predicted in a couple of years there'll just be such massive advantages to having an electric car, and the price will be down because of how quickly battery technology is dropping, like 50% in the last 2 years. That transition will happen without so much incentive anyways. But if you don't know his work, it's not a fair question to ask.
Well, can I respond to that? Because
Sure.
Since you've laid that out, it sounds very familiar. And so I have a chapter on that in the book called Renewables Will Win. But it's about solar and wind, but it's also about anything in which we say fossil fuels. Well, actually, governments don't have to do anything. They don't have to price or regulate. That's the implicit assumption, because the low emission technologies, whether it's in the production of energy or in the consumption side, such as something to move us around, a personal mobility device of some kind of vehicle, or to heat or cool our homes, or to get high temperature in industry, that we just say, innovation is going to take care of this. Well, you know what? I heard that 30 years ago. And this is what, like, some people don't seem to know, but this was articulated. They're like, oh, now we're interested in climate. Now we see innovation that's leading to alternatives. And so away to the races. That 30 years ago, the argument was made that, we thought oil prices were going to keep going up, and coal prices and natural gas prices, except for people who were experts in energy potential. And so people could easily get away with stuff where they said, oh, we've got all these innovations, they're going to win out. They're low carbon innovations. And the rest of us said, like the experts I talked to said, you don't think innovation isn't going to happen with fossil fuels? They're an amazing thing. Maybe we'll invent something. We don't know. Fracking. And sure enough, like, we didn't make up the name fracking, but I'm just saying the fracking innovation was something that experts said could easily happen. Like, they didn't detail it because we didn't know, something they'd be rich. And also, then I would say to that person, oh, so you say it's going to be dirt cheap. What's your price of oil when that happens? Is your price of oil $50 per barrel? Because the price of oil can get down to $5 per barrel, $10, and stay there easily.
Yeah, it is problematic for sure.
And so when I say that so people said to me, oh, energy efficiency is cheap compared to natural gas. I did an analysis on this 15 years ago. And I said, well, what price are you using for natural gas? And they had this price that went like this. And I said, all of our evidence is that the Earth's crust is chock-a-block full of natural gas. Innovation will continue, and natural gas will be dirt cheap. And what you're doing is you're working on the side of the fossil fuel industry because you're preventing the regulations and pricing that take care of this externality. And without that, you're continuing this process. And so I don't know this character, so maybe I'm not being fair to him, but he's saying something very similar that people said 30 years ago, and I hold those people responsible in part for the mess we're in. And I explain that in the chapter on renewables are winning.
Well, just in his defense, he argues it purely on economics. And
That's
also the timing, 30 years ago wasn't the time for these things because the price, solar, wind, electric vehicles are way too expensive, but that's all shifting very quickly, it seems.
But that was my point. My point is, where did he say the price of oil would be? Did he say, and by the way, the price of oil is $5 a barrel, and there's no government policy to put a price on it or regulate it, and these things will win anyway. So my point is still valid. I want to know.
Well, there's more to it than just price. He's talking about autonomous driving and all kinds of other things going on. I won't.
What you can do with a gasoline car, but anyway.
I would like to ask you about Mark Jacobson, your thoughts on Mark Jacobson's work about transitioning to 100% low energy or low carbon.
I'm with the people he tried to sue. No.
Uh-oh.
Why?
Let's not get into that.
No, so I'm not one of them. I talked to you about the Energy Modeling Forum, someone like John Wyant, a lot of the experts who have not bought into some particular argument that they're trying to make. So I think Mark Jacobson is an incredibly talented, knowledgeable person. And he has decided that that humanity can that we can get to zero emissions under a scenario called wind, water, and solar. So some hydropower, mostly run a river, I assume, but also using existing reservoirs, and then just wind and solar. And he's argued that our cost of energy will be the same as it is now. So in other words,
fossil fuel energy would be the same. You mean?
No, your cost of energy services.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So you currently, let's say, I'm going to assume your typical middle-class Canadian, maybe 5% of your budget goes to energy services, which is the capitalized cost of the furnace and the extra installation and the fuel that you use, 5%. And so the GDP, so that's individually percent of your budget, or the GDP as a whole would grow at the same rate with his wind, water, and solar, compared to a scenario in which we did the cheapest decarbonization options. So some of it would be carbon capture and storage. Some of it, we would still use nuclear plants where they exist. We might still use some biofuels where we think people can develop it. Brazil at one point developed, increasingly improving its biofuel production from a local environmental point of view while producing, for a while, half the fuels consumed in Brazil. Imagine that through semi-tropical areas on the planet. Mark Jaccard says no, says his one is cheaper than any of these alternatives. Well, what happened was a bunch of leading independent experts came out and said, we don't see how he can produce those numbers. And my own group has gone through there, and we don't get those numbers either. It's got, in our view, it's wishful thinking bias. He's way optimistic. And again, he doesn't tell us where the price of oil would go, the price of coal, the price of natural gas.
I'd like to just get back to what we can do practically. What would you say to the activists listening to you now in terms of a plan of action to get the Liberals to deliver? I know you've said a lot, but in terms of us lobbying or our media presence and various things that we want to do, is there anything else you would suggest before we lose you? I just want to get back to practicalities.
So Kathleen, and maybe you've had a quick look at it, but I wrote this book so that I wouldn't have to keep saying it over and over again, and that people would have this blueprint right in front of them. So you may not have read the last chapter as carefully as you'd like, but when you reread the last chapter, I'm so proud that people have taken my decision chart there, which shows you and the people you're asking, if the politician's doing this, do this. If they're doing that, do that. If they then do that, check this. It's a chart that exactly lays it out for you. I could try to describe it for you, but it basically says this. A, figure out if your politician is climate sincere or not, right? And we just talked all day about that. If they're not, you need to be working hard to get them unelected. And that may even involve civil disobedience one day, if it's so dire. And if enough people can do that to signal to their fellow citizens just how important this is. And I explain all that in a few chapters, and it also explains why in the Harper era, when we didn't have a climate sincere politician, I did, as Ken asked about, I did do civil disobedience. It was something I would never wanted to do. I did it in my 50s. It's not something that I was born to be doing, but I took it very seriously. I put my house at risk. It was a coal train. They could sue us. Those were the kind of actions that I really felt were necessary if we couldn't get a climate sincere politicians. When you get climate sincere politicians, don't be so perfectionist that if they make trade-offs to stay in power, that you don't support them and help them get reelected. Like, I call that being childish. It's like, I didn't get everything I want, and therefore, like, you have to be strategic. You have to say, I got to keep these people in power because here's who otherwise will be in power. And in the last federal election, that was an argument I ended up making in British Columbia a fair bit, because there were people who said, Trudeau's going to build an oil pipeline. He can't be climate sincere. Let's defeat him. And it'd be like, well, if we defeat him, Andrew Scheer will be the prime minister. And so understand that this is the world you live in. I mean, if you start to see, or in certain ridings, that the Greens are doing really well, or even the NDP perhaps, then vote strategically for them if they have the better chance. But don't put into power, like our system of voting, first past the post, really means that you get the government you don't want to have the worst government. Like, you don't get to pick the best government, but you want to prevent getting the worst government, the most climate insincere. And so how do you act strategically about that? This is just a little snippet of what I do in that last chapter, which I know you've already read, but I think you might want to read it again a little more carefully, because it maps out those things. And I've been so happy that reviewers of the book have been all excited about that chapter and even have tweeted that last figure that shows what to do.
No, but I know I read it and I love that chart, but others, the whole point of the webinar is so that you could help introduce other people to the concept. So.
Yep. So the book is free online. You can go to my website, markjaccard.com, and I explain how to get copies of the book, or you can buy it for your e-reader for $10 or order it for $22. And that chapter maps out what I just gave to you, a synopsis. I gave you a synopsis, what to do when your government is climate insincere, how to try to get prevent a climate insincere government from forming power. And then once that government's in there, not to get all caught up in having them spend a lot of money as an indication, because that means they're not doing what they need to do, which is regulations and or pricing. And on the regulations, it's the most important are, for example, them saying, we're gonna phase out coal plants. So it's like what Ontario did, what Alberta started under Notley, and what the federal Liberals are doing. We gotta finish that. And then it would be the same thing. We have to phase out gasoline cars. And we have to phase out the use of natural gas and oil in buildings. And those are the biggest things.
That sounds like an excellent summary. Ken, anything else before we sum up?
We're at 2:30 now, so just a couple comments I'd like to read, and then we could finish, I think. First, this is from Garth. Hi, Mark. Thanks so much for your book. It's fantastic. I'm a federal public servant who works in trade policy, so I took particular interest in the concept of carbon clubs, whereby groups of countries could use carbon border adjustments to create incentives for trading partners to adopt more ambitious climate policies. One barrier I see to widespread adoption of this concept is the likelihood that it would impose a disproportionate economic burden on developing countries who remain more reliant on fossil fuels. What advice would you have for addressing this challenge?
Okay, I love this question. So I can take a minute to answer.
Is Garth a friend of yours, or just?
No, I mean, I love the question because it isn't what we've covered here. And
Right.
my book is really about how to go global. And that was kind of hinted at when we were just talking about oil markets and whether we should be shutting down Canadian oil supply and that we're somehow helping the planet. I'm sorry, I don't buy into that. It's what we do. It's the Powering Past Coal initiative that Canada's doing. We're trying to form a club on doing that. We started with the UK. Other countries are joining. Of course, it's initially the countries that were intending to do so, but eventually it's got to be preventing new coal plants in Pakistan, India, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia. And so we've got to be making that happen. We have to have a federal government that is an agent of change globally. And that actually can help that government domestically, saying, we get it, conservatives, we understand that we need to solve this globally, and that's why we're trying to do this. A specific, and then I have a chapter in the book, that is talking about that humanity for 30 years now, almost 30 years, 27 years, has been trying to develop a voluntary agreement that would be binding and that would actually reduce emissions. And that's an impossibility as a voluntary agreement. So what people have talked about 25 years ago, and people wrote books about this, is no, the only way we'll ever get global action is if we play hardball and we put tariffs on countries that are laggards, that are not part of it. And the countries that will really be, yes, it could be the United States under a Donald Trump, it could have been China 10 years ago, but into the future, the countries that you'll be putting tariffs on are the developing countries. So, because they will be the least willing to give up wonderful fossil fuels. So you can say, oh, solar and wind is all cheap. No, I've done the economics. I've seen it just recently for Vietnam. The smarter thing, the cheaper thing, if you want to develop your economy, is build a coal plant in Vietnam. That's the cheaper option. The coal's basically free. They know how to build these things. They're cheap. And so what happens is, the only way they're not going to do that is if there's a tariff that makes it the costs greater for them than the benefits of doing so. And so people look at that and say, oh, but I have this vision that it's all this happy global community where everybody just helps everyone else out. That's not how the world really works. We in rich countries have not elected governments who are taxing us to pay for a cheap energy system in the rest of the developing world. That's not how it's going to happen. For 30 years we've seen it hasn't, and I see nothing to see that. I don't see anybody campaigning to win an election to transfer money to help with clean energy in other countries, like a significant amount of money. So people talk about forming clubs, and those clubs of countries who are early actors or who are leading more aggressively are going to put tariffs on other countries. And this will really affect the developing world. And so you have to say, though, what's the better thing? Is that we continue with the delusion that we've been living under for 30 years, and then we have the full impacts or fuller impacts of climate change over the next 3 decades? Because guess what? Guess where the most harm is going to happen? It's going to happen in the developing world. We're going to watch as horrendous things happen in the developing world because they're less able to organize themselves to help each other out, to infrastructure, to prevent rising seas in the Bay of Bengal, to all of these kinds of things mean that we're going to watch as horrendous loss of life and terrible outcomes happen in the developing world. So it is better to force them to have slightly higher energy costs and therefore slightly more expensive products and therefore slightly less trade with us as they develop. And so a development that's a little bit slower than a development that's devastated. And that is the argument for the climate clubs and the tariffs and so on.
How soon do you think that might happen?
Oh, it should have happened a long time ago. I think Obama was interested, or the advisors I know around him, in some kind of, he was trying to deal with the Chinese and then make that part of global discussions. The Europeans now have come out with their Green Deal, and they're saying at the commission level, at least, it's not sure if it'll work through with all the countries, but a real aggressive decarbonization now in their electricity sectors, and they're starting to move it into transportation. And in doing that, they're saying we need to put tariffs on imports from other countries. I think they're really thinking about Donald Trump winning re-election, but it isn't just that. And it would be, to me, that's essential. But how soon? I still think I think it should have happened 15 years ago, and the only way it's going to happen is if we really talk about it, and we have a federal government that talks about that. So if governments ask me for opinions, the federal government in Canada, I talk about carbon tariffs a lot of the time. And so, Kathleen, to your earlier question, what should people be lobbying for? It's to really get a discussion and about carbon tariffs, because a lot of people will say, oh no, I want to really help out Vietnam and so on. And so this is why we need to have this debate about, wait a minute, what are you actually saying? Because aren't you saying, I want a world that is not going to happen and hasn't been for 30 years, and therefore will have a devastating outcome for the people in the developing world?
Well, actually, I attended a webinar about a week ago, and it showed the number of coal plants being built in Vietnam. It was absolutely frightening, about half a dozen at least. So, and the Philippines, and so I don't think we realized when we decarbonize here, and Trudeau wants to get rid of coal plants, what's happening around us.
Well, yeah, except Trudeau has been
no, but I mean, what's happening in other countries?
Yeah, but Trudeau is well aware of what's going on in other countries, and that's why Catherine McKenna went into Paris, and I was so thrilled. The most important thing about Canada in Paris was the Powering Past Coal Global Initiative. That's huge compared to anything else that we're talking about, like stopping a Trans Mountain pipeline. Who cares? Coal plants around the world are huge. So in the book, I have a pie chart that shows you if we stay on this path in 2050, and the emissions are coming from the developing world especially, and they're mostly in electricity generation and transportation. So what are we doing in those two areas? And that's why, so the Trudeau government, thankfully, was like the first time we had a federal government that really understood, act locally, and then think globally and act globally. And that's where people that you're trying to talk to need to support a government that does that.
Thank you.
Well, I think that's a good place to end it. Before we get into questions about Michael Moore's film, I think we have a good time to just put an end to this. Thank you very much, Mark. We're very appreciative. You have very thoughtful answers about every question we asked. and answers that are surprising often. So that's the most useful thing, not just singing to the choir. So there's lots of food for thought, and I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you, and I really enjoyed this, and I want to thank Kathleen, you, and Ken, you, for setting this up. And if there is demand down the road, I'd be happy to do a sequel or something like that. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. You were very generous.
Thanks. Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. All right.
Bye for now.
Bye.
And thanks to our viewers.